Welcome to the latest episode of Five on the Floor on the Five Reasons Sports Network. Thanks for joining us on your favorite podcast app on Apple Podcasts, on Android, Spotify, or the Five Reasons YouTube channel. Also, make sure you're subscribing to Off the Floor. We put the link right here in the description. This is where you can get off of Twitter and hang out with Heat fans and us all day and all night long. But we're also adding to the channel. One thing we're going to start doing, stage shows and Q&As over there on Off the Floor. So some of that stuff may not make it to the podcast feed. You're going to want to be on Off the Floor to get all of it. You're going to be able, again, to ask questions of the hosts. We're going to bring people on stage. Lots of cool stuff we're going to be doing. So check it out at Off the Floor. Again, link right here in the description, $2.99 per month. Also check out the great sponsors of the Five Reasons Sports Network, Prize Picks. Use the code 5, F-I-V-E. Get their great new promotion, which is legal in the state of Florida and many other states. Use the code 5. You put down $5. You play it. Recommend that you play more than that if you'd like, but that's up to you. But once you put down the 5, they'll give you 50. So this is a 10-to-1 match at Prize Picks. Download our daily fantasy partner at prizepicks.com, the Google Play Store, or the Apple App Store. Again, use the code 5. And now, today's episode.
Down to Biscayne. Yikes. 5 on the floor. Ride for my dogs. Where here's the thing, you can check the score. Hustle hard, couple scars, wearing rubber frauds. Just like Butler said, you in trouble, y'all. Kept the floor playing, got it all banned. Y'all seen the block, stop with one hand. And Pat we trust, it's power, have the guts. We're here to bring the heat, y'all can hang it up.
Welcome to Five on the Floor, a daily insider show on the Miami Heat and the NBA, featuring Ethan Skolnick, Greg Sylvander, and Alex Toledo, plus others from the Five Reasons Sports Network.
All right, welcome back to Five on the Floor. Here's today's floor plan. I'm Ethan Skolnick. You can follow me at Ethan J. Skolnick and at Five Reasons Sports. I got Greg Sylvander. You can follow him at Greg Sylvander. Make sure you check out recent episodes, including one that I did with Alex and with Bentovia from our network, where we got into what was the more satisfying season, the season where you are the number 1 seed, but you lose in the Eastern Conference Finals because of one Jimmy Butler shot, so you get that close, or when you're a play-in team and it's a struggle the entire season, but then you go to the finals. So had an interesting debate about that one. Greg, you had thoughts on that before we move on?
I just definitively want to say that it's the series. Like, you have to think about throughout the, and we won't stay here long, audience, I promise, but if you just think about the length of a season and you think about how many months did I go at peace and with satisfying basketball, you have to take the 1 seed, and you felt like you made it through the run. You had home court. I know it ended with a heartbreak, but to me, there's no doubt that that was a more fun season, except for the little shot in the arm that you get when you compare it to the other season where it was kind of a slugfest throughout the year. And then you get to the finals at the very end. I feel like the first one is much more it's the better course, I would say.
Well, I will say there's a bias here because you had to handle a lot of those post-game podcasts during the 22-23 season, and a lot of those were not a lot of fun. I will say you're in the minority on this, that the majority of people, whether it was polled, whether it was inside our network, said they take the finals appearance. Even if it's a really, painful slog in the regular season, that they would take.
I'm calling their bluff.
Well, there you go. It's good to have a little disagreement. All right, the other one we got into, and I did this with Alex and Brady, was Zach Lowe threw out the possibility of the Heat going after Dame again. We're not going to do 58 episodes, but we did one where we looked at not just Dame, but 10 other possible buy low candidates during the season if various franchises blow up. And I think the conclusion we came to of all of them, I like Bruce Brown as a 1-year option, but with Toronto's situation. But I think the conclusion we came to is Kyle Kuzma might be interesting at some point here. And that's a team that is going to blow up because they're not trying to win in Washington. So anyway, a couple of episodes you may want to check out there. And again, we had some disagreements on some of those, which are always good. Today, we're going to look at 3 little words that Heat fans hate so much. Run it back. Now, Brady has added run it back harder to this. I guess based on the fact that, you hope that maybe Jimmy Butler plays more games this year. and more of the players are available. But that's the way that he's characterized it. But run it back is it's like it's the toxic 3 letters now. This has replaced "we have enough" as a slogan that Heat fans, or "winning or misery." What are the other ones? There's lots of them. We used to put a lot of them on T-shirts, right?
Those are the 2, though. You got it.
Yeah. So now this is the whole thing where Heat fans, if there's not a major move made in the offseason, they say that the team has run it back. So what we wanted to do was look at what running it back really means. I have a theory on it, which I've mentioned here before, but I won't drop it here at the very beginning. But let's go through the roster, Greg, of this build, because we talk about the Heat in terms of builds. Things are not always completely linear because lots of things happen. And sometimes, you refresh a team during a build to such a degree that it doesn't resemble the team that it was in the first place. Then we kind of say a new build has started. But mostly when we're talking about builds, we're talking about their best players. So, for instance, the late 90s, there really was no build pre-Riley. Like they drafted a bunch of guys in the first round who had success in college, whether it was Smith, Cycli, Glenn Rice, etc. Then the first build really started with Riley acquiring Alonzo Mourning. That was build 1. I think that's where we start the clock here. And that build then became, and we're going to get into that build a little bit, but that build added Tim Hardaway to it, and he became the second piece of that build. And then there were other players that became core players around it. Then that build was changed dramatically in 2000, which again, we'll talk about that. And they never got to really see that through because of Zoe's illness. And then there's a new build that started kind of when Dwayne was drafted. And we can talk about when we want to start the clock on that. But you had Karan and then Dwayne drafted 2002, 2003. But then really we sort of characterize the build starting as when Shaq was acquired, because that build went a completely different direction. They drafted Darrell Wright out of high school over Jameer Nelson, in part because they thought they were building with this young team. And then it was like, oh, well, you took Darrell. I mean, Jameer could have played right away when Shaq. And, so that did. And then the funny part of it, that was, I had heard at the time that Stan was the guy that didn't really want Jameer. And then ultimately Jameer became Stan's point guard, beloved point guard.
He loved him. Yeah.
For Orlando. So anyway, that was a build that went a little bit of a different direction, but it sort of starts with Shaq. And then there's, even though Dwayne was here, we kind of characterized the big 3 as a build. We can say they were building to it by clearing cap space in 09 or into 2010, and sort of leaving Dwayne out on an island with Michael Beasley and Udonis, etc. But ultimately, there's a big 3 build, right? And then LeBron leaves, and you were trying to start a new build, kind of with Bosh and Wade, but then Dragic comes in, but then Bosh got sick. So there's different ways to play on this, but clearly one build that we can say is a build is the Jimmy Butler build, the 2019 build. Even though Hero and Bam were here, Hero had just been drafted, Bam had been here. It really starts when Jimmy arrives, not necessarily when Bam was drafted, because Bam wasn't even a starter for his first couple seasons. Anyway, so now that we've characterized what the builds typically are, let me go through this list with you, okay? You know the answer to this, but if I had just asked you to guess at the start, how many players from the bubble team are still on the roster? What would you have guessed the correct number right away?
Yeah, just because this run it back topic is so prevalent on social media, that the 4 guys that have been mainstays, the 2 shooters, Duncan and Tyler, and the 2 guys at the top, Bam and Jimmy. I feel like it's kind of low hanging fruit to call those 4 out. I think where we get around the rest of the roster is where I think fans are starting to get edgy. And also some of the guys, some of those 4 that I mentioned that have stuck it out throughout all this and made it to 2024, 25. Those are the guys that I think fans, have question marks about. But those are the 4 that have been the mainstays, right?
Yeah, they have been. And so I'll go through the list here of the core rotation players for these teams. So the team that lost in the finals in the bubble, and remember, they made a trade during the season. So who was supposed to be the core at the very beginning didn't end up being the core by the end of that year because, Waiters had kind of Waiters and James Johnson, it run its course there, and you were trying to get rid of contracts. I mean, you already gotten rid of Hassan, but Winslow initially was perceived, at least by the public and the media, as part of this build. I mean, he had 27, 7, and 7 in the opening game, 2019, when Jimmy missed those first 3 games. And people forget that Jimmy had a personal issue to attend to. He wasn't at the first 3 games of his Heat tenure. And Winslow, I remember standing in front of his locker, and he talking about it being his team. And of course, that didn't last very long. But anyway, but the core team was really established, with that trade. So here was their primary rotation for those who don't remember it. It was Butler, Bam, Duncan, Dragic, and Crowder. And then Hero, Iguodala, Kendrick Nunn, who started the season as a starter and, of course, had COVID, kind of got figured out a little bit after that. Kelly Olynyk and Myers Leonard. And Myers started a lot of games that year, but that was the core 10. All right, so from that team, as we said, we're now entering season, I guess, 6, okay? And 4 guys have survived. Butler, Bam, Duncan, Hero. Now, if you go through the list of sort of how those other rotation players disappeared, Iguodala was on the team the next year. Nunn was on the team the next year. Dragic was on the team the next year. Crowder was replaced basically by Ariza. Dedmon replaced Olynyk, and Bielitsa replaced Myers Leonard. Okay. So 6 of the top 10 of the guys who played the most were different from year 1. I'm sorry, not 6 of the top 10, because Dragic was still there, Iguodala was there, Nunn was still there. Okay, so at that point, I guess it was 3 of the top 10 were different. Then you go to the next year, still Bam, Butler, Hero, Duncan, but now Lowry's replaced Dragic, Tucker's replaced Ariza. Strus has, I guess, replaced Bielitsa. I mean, this is not exact, right? Mm-hmm. Nunn is gone. Vincent's in. Caleb Martin is in as well, even though I believe Dedmon was still there. So you've changed a roster again. Okay, somewhat.
They didn't run it back that year.
They did not, right? Then you go to the year after that. Again, still Butler, Bam, Hero, Duncan. You still have Strus and Vincent and Martin and Lowry, but during that year you bring in Love and Highsmith. So now if we're now in year 4, if you're looking at the comp between year 4, which was 22-23, team that went to the finals and lost, right? You still have Butler, Bam, Hero, Duncan, but you've replaced Dragic, Crowder, Iguodala, Nunn, Olynyk, Leonard with Strus, Vincent, Martin, Lowry, Love, Highsmith. And then you go to last year. Again, still Butler, Bam, Hero, Duncan. But now, over the course of time, over the trade, Rozier replaces Lowry, right? You still have Martin. You still have Highsmith. You add DeLon Wright for a period of time. You have Love for a full season. Jovic and Jaquez emerge, right, into the rotation. One is a first-year player, one is a second-year player. And now this year, Greg, again, still Butler, Bam, Hero, Duncan, Rozier from last year. But again, now you're getting him for a full season. Jovic and Jaquez again. Burks has replaced, I don't know, Wright, I guess.
For all intents and purposes, that works.
Right. And of course you don't have Martin anymore, right? So replace and him too, in terms of primary. And again, you have Love back, you have Highsmith back. And you have rookies that you've brought in, Ware, Johnson, and Larson primary among those. Okay, so on the overall here, as I present that to you, is this a build that has run it back?
If we're being super technical about it, hell no. And fans are going to think I'm carrying water for the organization, and they're going to probably yell at me in my DMs on Twitter, and that's okay. But they really haven't run it back if you look at it. I mean, there's a couple seasons in there where I think fans just wanted more movement. One being last off season, the Dame off season, and then this off season that we just got through. I just think fans wanted a little bit more. And I think this is where it ties in with previous builds. When you just talk about how many years did you stick with your core guys up at the top of the roster and not make moves, that's where I think this becomes an interesting conversation, because even Terry Rozier, and this is another thing fans may get pissed off about, this is really his like where we're going to learn what Terry can be in a Miami Heat uniform is this year. I feel like last year was, you know, you got to see moments of it. There was that game up at Cleveland where he looked really, really good. There were other games where he looked like there were some subtle things with him fitting and stuff like that that didn't, you know, quite strike a balance with Tyler. But you didn't see a ton of him and Tyler together too. Didn't see him at all in the playoffs. So you have to think about Terry in some degree as incremental to the total. And I know people don't want to hear that shit because they wanted trades and they want transactions, but I think that that is part of this. They haven't really run it back. There's been a couple seasons where, yeah, they brought back a lot of the same guys, but I think sometimes just the injection of just like a Jaquez Jovic scenario where you get those two guys to pop all of a sudden, that can change the complexion of fans feeling like you're running it back. And this year, it just remains to be seen who's going to pop, who's going to fit, and are you going to classify that as running it back? And I know what you're alluding to with what fans really think about running it back, and we'll get to that later. But I personally think that it's a little harsh to just say that they've straight up run it back year over year when really you look at the rotations and it's not the case.
Well, I think there's two things, actually. There's one which we'll get to, but the other thing is this. I think when fans are talking about running it back, they also sort of mean the structure of the build, which is that you still have Jimmy and Bam at the top with the clear separation between them and everybody else.
Agree.
I think that's one of the things that really plays into, which, again, the other part of this is connected to it. But I think that's primarily what fans are saying is that, okay, you've got Bam and Jimmy, and then you're kind of surrounding them with, well, yes, the two shooters who have been here, one of which was phased out at a certain point, reemerged. Now we don't know how healthy he's going to be, dealing with a back injury in Duncan, and the other who is the fans' real issue. But the other players, it's typically the structure of this has been undrafted finds, right? Like from, from whether it was none, then to sort of, Highsmith, more, Strus and Vincent and Martin, and now Highsmith. And so you're surrounding kind of with undrafteds. And then the point guard, we've gone from Dragic to Lowry to Rozier. And so a lot of the categories look the same to fans, and there's no one who can emerge, who can challenge Jimmy and Bam at the top of the pecking order.
Yeah, to get in that tier.
As an overall player, and I think that's what fans are touching on. But the other part of this is, and you know what? Let's do it after the break, because this became clear to me like months ago. And when people ask me what running back is, and I really think this is for fans mostly just about one person. I just think that's where it's at. All right. We do want to mention a great sponsor of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. And this sponsor, you're going to be hearing a lot about them, because the one thing we do know the Heat will do this year is they'll defend. They got Bam. They will defend. They got Spoelstra. And so we're going to have a segment called Defending the House, which is very appropriate because our new segment is sponsored by The Real Estate Shop. And this is Javier Iglesias and Amanda Martin. These are great local people, and what they can do is they can help buyers and sellers in real estate. They're honest, they're approachable, they're smart, they're nimble and protective of their clients, and they serve the entire Tri-County area. So Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, they got a proven on-market strategy. The Real Estate Shop sellers earn the most money in the shortest time frame because of their deep understanding of the local market. They're dedicated to ensuring a smooth and enjoyable home buying and home selling journey. So reach out to them. A couple of different ways you can do this. First, you can find them on Instagram at the Fort Lauderdale Realtor. You can give them a call at 954-268-9812. Again, that's 954-268-9812. Or you can check out their website at Real Estate Shop. That's with 2 P's and an E, FL.com. That's Real Estate Shop, FL.com. And look for our regular segment on our post-game shows as soon as those resume. So this really for fans is about Tyler Hero, isn't it?
It is, which sucks because he's a young player, a drafted player, an ascending player still to some degree. I think maybe I'd get challenged a bit with some on that. And yeah, it's about basically the fact that he's back. I think that everyone has always thought he's the carrot, the talent that gets dangled out there to maybe bring in a player that is comparable to the tier of Bam and Jimmy. I mean, like, and if we just think about this in concept, a lot of people thought Dame would arrive here and immediately shoot up the pecking order to maybe be the first option on the team and give Jimmy a reprieve in that sense. And Bam could obviously focus on defense, even though I think he may be able to take on more offensively as we, look ahead to this season. But for me, it's about Tyler, and it's about the fact that he's still here. And for a player that talented, and we did the top 40 in Heat history, and some people had issue with where we put Tyler, but I don't. I think we put him right where he belonged, which, if I remember correctly, was 16. Somewhere near the top 15. Yeah, 16.
Yeah.
So like, it sucks that it's came to that, but I think that is, people just expect that that's the player. Maybe him and Duncan to a little bit of a lesser degree. I feel like Duncan did things last year that the real b-ball heads understood what kind of leap he made. I thought it was one of the best stories in the league that got undercovered last year, is the way he transformed his game in a lot of ways. But maybe people want Duncan because he's a big contract that could be moved, and people think that maybe he's been overpaid throughout his tenure in Heat history now. But this is really, it boils down to Tyler, and that's just, it sucks for a young kid like that who has that much talent to be kind of thought of as an afterthought and as just basically a tradable piece.
And I think when you look at his progression, we've talked about it, he has become a better player in some ways over time. I mean, he's a better player than he was in the bubble. And yet people look back at the bubble like, if you just get bubble hero again, you don't want bubble hero. I mean, he's been better since in virtually every category, and not just that, but in the more technical stuff that isn't measured by the stats. But this is always about the third guy. And I just want to go through the late 90s build a little bit, and also the big three builds, and just in comparison here, because let's start the 95-96. So, okay, Pat comes in, right, in 95, and he inherits this sort of mess, right? Like, I mean, he goes against Zoe, like, literally, what was it, like 2 days after the season started, or like 2 days before the season.
Right before they played Cleveland in the first game. I remember it like yesterday.
Okay, so right then. And then, of course, he goes out and he gets Hardaway in February. And
Walt Williams.
And Walt Williams, well, a whole bunch of guys there. Like, if you look at that roster, this is one of those transition years. They had this is how many players played for the Heat that year. This is 95-96. Askins, Chapman, Bimbo Coles, Ty Corbin, Sasha Danilovic, the chain-smoking rookie then. He was one of the reasons Pat stopped going after European players. LaRon Ellis, Kevin Gamble, Chris Gatling. He had a couple tours of duty with them, from what I remember. Ron Grandison, Tim Hardaway, Stacey King, Vashawn Leonard, who was a rookie, by the way, at that point. Jeff Malone, 12-year veteran. He actually played for the Heat briefly that year. He played for Washington for a while. Alonzo Mourning, Pete Myers, Billy Owens, Terrence Rencher, Danny Shays, Tony Smith, Kurt Thomas, Walt Williams, Kevin Willis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Tony Smith had a game. Shout out to Tony Smith. I remember his game against the Lakers.
Tony Smith did have a game. I believe that's 22 players. I think 22 or 23 players on my quick math here that played for the Heat that year. So that's really a transition year. I don't know. I would start the build the next year. I just think, to be fair. Okay, so the guys actually had training camp. So that next year, of course, they tried to get Juwan Howard. They actually tried to get Gary Payton. People forget about this. They tried to get Gary Payton. His agent, by the way, was Aaron Goodwin. They just dealt with the Aaron Goodwin situation with Dame Lillard about 25 years later, roughly. So
Gary wanted to come too.
Gary wanted to come, but ultimately went back to Seattle. And as a result, that's why the Heat re-signed Hardaway. It was not a sure thing the Heat were going to re-sign Hardaway. People don't remember that. But that next year, and then, of course, Juwan Howard, the 10-foot pole that Pat said was that David Stern, put in a certain place in Pat's body. I always remember that conference call where they took away Juwan Howard. And so the Heat pivoted and they brought in Marley. PJ Brown was always coming, I think. I think that's been misconstrued also. He was coming, but he was not necessarily going to be a starter because Jawan was going to play with Zoe. My memory's a little hazy on this, but I think that's what it was. It was Marley who was brought in after Jawan was taken away. So
that's correct.
So that becomes the beginning of this build. So, but if you look at that build, which was basically a 4-year build before they finally gave up on it to a certain degree and decided, okay, we got to make a big move in 2000. And they lost to the Knicks 3 times. First year they beat the Knicks. The last 3 years they lost the Knicks. 99 was probably their best chance. That was the Allen Houston shot year. If they'd gotten there was no Jordan in the way. They could have beaten that Spurs team. That team could have won a championship. Okay, that was the team, I believe, with Terry Porter. But if you look at that build, and I know free agency was different then, and everything was a little bit different from a transaction standpoint. You weren't dealing with, second aprons and all that kind of stuff. But really, they made almost no changes in those 4 years. Like, that was running it back, right?
Yeah. And we were fine with it back then. Like, there were a few Heat fans, like, I'll remember specifically people wanted Mitch Richmond along the way. Mm-hmm. There was some Derek Coleman buzz for a little while throughout those stretches, if you talk about the off seasons. But for the most part, they just swapped out the backup point guard every year. It was like they went from Eric Murdoch to Terry Porter
to John Crotty.
Yeah,
or I don't know if those they were, and then the last
97.
year was Anthony Carter. They had 4 different backup point guards during that period of time. Porter probably, we love you, John, but Porter probably being the best. But Murdoch was good. They were all 4 of them were good, actually. And there's days you needed a backup point guard, like Tim with his knees and all that. Like, you needed a guy who could run the team when Tim was out. And of course, they made the Mashburn trade during the 96-97 season. So he only really played the last kind of third of the year. Kurt Thomas was traded there. But again, I'm still going to count the build as starting at the beginning of that year. And again, there were very few changes until 2000 when, and even though the history on this, they went after Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady, and they didn't get either of them, but they got Eddie Jones, they got Mace, they got Grant, and then and Brian Grant, and then Zoe got sick. And so again, to make the point, like, I don't think it's that they've been more stagnant now than Pat was during that time. It's just that he made a flurry of moves at the beginning to put that team together.
And then a flurry at the end.
And then a flurry at the end. And there were basically 4 years separating. I think the other part of this that is making fans kind of yawn at this stage is it's not year 4, it's year 6.
Mm-hmm.
And you've made this point that, their builds typically have not gone past the 4th or 5th year. And that's actually true. That was not by choice during the Big 3 era, but even in the Big 3 era, yes, there was a lot of turnover because they were rotating like decrepit backup centers, like at the beginning, right? Until Smoke had a different style. I mean, Ilgauskas, McGlure, Dampier, Turioff, etc. Drafted Dexter Pittman, and then got away from that philosophy completely. And Joel was the one guy who stuck around, right? That's why we put him in our top 40. And Miller got amnestied after the 3rd year, and they brought in Shane the 2nd year. They brought in Ray the 3rd year. So they made incremental changes to it, but it was not. I mean, again, they weren't breaking up. I mean, unless they'd lost that game, to Boston, maybe they might have traded Bosch, but they weren't. They weren't breaking up. LeBron, Dwayne, and Chris, and UD. If you want to include him as core to the build, which I would, right? Yes. And then once they drafted Norris.
And Rio,
obviously Rio, right? So add Rio to that. So Rio and Haslam, those 2, with the other 3, and then there were other members of the Little 12, as Rio used to call it, that kind of subbed in and out. But for the most part, the build, the top guys stayed the same, but there were championships in there, right? And you weren't looking to change it. LeBron changed it for you. Otherwise, you just would have kept rotating around those top 3 as long as Dwayne could stay upright. And, I guess you didn't know at the time that Chris was ultimately going to have the blood clot problem. So, again, I don't think this has been like, to go over the overall list before we close this, this has not been egregious running it back. We're going to talk about how many different players have come in around Bam and Jimmy and Tyler and Duncan. It really hasn't been compared to others in Heat history. And, even the Shaq team, I mean, that team kind of exploded because Shaq got old and, ornery and didn't really want to do anything anymore. And so they ultimately had to, move him. And then he became Sean Marion, who became Jermaine O'Neal. But again, Greg, I think the term running it back is in this context a little bit unfair. I think they just haven't found the front guy to run with the top two. And that's really what fans are talking about.
I feel like run it back got solidified as a buzzword, as a lightning rod for Heat fans to get upset, as kind of like engagement farming on the internet for Heat fans that want to basically troll or just be disgruntled in general. It had a lot to do with, and I come back to this always like a broken record, when the Dame thing fell through. Everyone felt like that was such a layup that I feel like that's when it really solidified running it back, because everyone just thought you needed the one guy to say only there. He did that, and it didn't transpire. And so that's when Heat fans dug their heels in on this run it back concept, when really, when you look at functionally the rotation, and particularly even as we come into this season, there's a chance that there could be a lot of different guys that pop into the rotation that have not been here before, that are new, but it's just they're hung up on this Tyler Hero situation. And I think to a lesser degree, Duncan Robinson. I don't think anybody has a problem with Jimmy and Bam being there. It's about supplementing them with one guy that is closer to their tier. We've talked a lot about like maybe this team actually needs the Antoine Walker, James Posey, Jason Williams trade. And I think Heat fans maybe would warm up to that kind of deal as well. But those are just harder and harder to pull off with the way the aprons are, and just like being able to pull off multi-team trades in this particular economic climate in the NBA. It's just not as easy to necessarily pull that off for the Heat at this moment in time. But to me, it's a shame that it's kind of came to this, because they don't necessarily run it back to the degree that Heat fans are saying they are, but you're not going to shut them up about it. They're going to keep griping.
No, they're not. They are. And the other thing is, in the quick comparison to the late 90s teams, I know there's a lot of talk now about like, okay, do Jimmy, Bam, and Tyler fit? That Jimmy and Bam has always seemed kind of, it's sort of an awkward personality fit, and also, an awkward offensive fit. All the numbers suggest, and again, the results suggest, 3 conference finals and 2 finals appearances, that it's worked out pretty well. And then, of course, how Tyler fits with the whole thing, particularly with Jimmy and with the starting group. But, going back to the late 90s, like Zoe and Tim like fit from a playing perspective, very different, completely opposite personalities. But Mash never really fit with either of them personality-wise, and it was always kind of a question about how long that thing could last. So there is some recall to some of those things that happened. And I guess maybe I don't remember there being quite as much frustration from the fan base about keeping that team together. There was a lot from columnists. I will say that, because we had a lot of columnists in the town at that time, because we actually had, functional newspapers with lots of reporters. And I just remember Greg Stoda, who I worked with at the Palm Beach Post, and also I believe Levitard and Hyde and others constantly writing in the last 2 years of that, look, they need to change this mix. Like, it's just, they keep losing the Knicks, they're beating their heads against the wall. But I didn't sense it from fans. And part of that may be simply I didn't sense it from fans because even though I was covering the team, I wasn't interacting with 75,000 of them on Twitter on a regular basis, because Twitter didn't exist. And that probably is the other part of this, is that Twitter has made fans just jumpy for the next move, because it's what drives the engagement there with them, and some of these particular accounts, but just in general, it drives the conversation. And so the Heat have not delivered the dopamine rush in the off seasons.
Exactly.
Right. That's really what this is. And the dopamine rush they wanted this offseason was Tyler Hero has been traded. And, I don't even think most of them cared what came back. And that is what I think you're right about when you say it's a shame, because we're talking about a good player, and he's had some unfortunate luck. And then there's also the very reasonable debate about how he best fits on the team and what what role he should accept. That's a reasonable conversation to have. But
and
to
maybe
say
his
you just get rid of
fragility
Tyler
as well.
Well, that, which again, we didn't say it. The president of the team said it. So that just that hiked the whole thing. But that's kind of where it's at right now. Is I think that they will, as long as Jimmy and Bam are here, if they got a star for Tyler and Duncan or something like that, we wouldn't hear run it back anymore. I don't think so. I just think that's where it's at. All right. So anyway, you're all welcome to argue with me about this. I don't know if we'll actually print the Run It Back Harder T-shirts, but if we do, Brady will get he'll get royalties for that one. All right. Check out the rest of our episodes. A lot more coming up this week. We're gonna start bringing on some national reporters as well to kind of assess the Heat and where they stand. And then, if we haven't told you already, we will have full coverage in the Bahamas. I found an alley to stay in because the hotels were all too expensive. So I'll be down there for a week or at least 5 days. And our guy, Timothy Bain, is going to be down there with me. So we'll actually have probably the most coverage down at training camp this year. So hopefully we'll be able to provide a lot of the podcast. Also media day. We'll have a full crew out there as well. And we're planning on interviewing as many players as we can. So you won't have to hear from us as much. Anyway, thanks to Greg. And if you're hearing this on the weekend, have a great weekend.
Thank you for listening to the 5 on the Floor on the 5 Reasons Sports Network. After all, someone needs to listen to my dad.